Okay, well, welcome everyone. This land acknowledgement was written by Alex McKay for the Jackman Humanities Institute, and it was adapted for this lunch. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the Digital Humanities Network operates, the lands on which all participants across the United States and Canada live and work, and the land hosting the servers and cables connecting us all to this virtual space. Indigenous people have shaped its history over thousands of years. On this land, they have developed distinct languages, cultures, economies, and ways of life. Here in Toronto, this land upon which we are assembled remains a sacred gathering place for many peoples of Turtle Island. We want to show respect for this by acknowledging that we are on the land of several Indigenous nations, paying special recognition to the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Coming from myself, I would also like to acknowledge the continued histories of injustice, oppression, and violence perpetuated by white settler colonialist systems and institutions. It is not enough to be grateful for the land we now occupy. We must recognize and seek to redress injuries, both past and present. So in terms of housekeeping, our three presenters will each speak for 5 to 7 minutes. We'll hold all questions until the end, but then we'll open up the lunch for discussion. The audience, you are all very welcome to participate. We encourage your questions, and we're holding the event as a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar so that you can use your microphones in the chat as normal. The hand raising function is available if you prefer to do it that way. So when it's your turn, please unmute your mic and pose your questions. The hand raising function is the preferred method of indicating a question, but you're fully welcome to use, type into the chat or, post your question for the moderator to read. So without further ado, please let me introduce our moderator for today, Imre Szeman. He is the University Research Chair of Environmental Communication and Professor of Communication Arts at the University of Waterloo. Imre teaches and conducts research in the energy humanities, environmental studies, and social and political philosophy. He is the co-founder of the Petrocultures Research Group, a member of the International Panel on Behavior Change, and a fellow of the Canadian International Council. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and the other members of the Digital Humanities Network that organized this lightning lunch. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be able to join everybody and to have this discussion with the panelists. I think before I invite the three panelists, three people who have joined us, to give us 5 to 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minute presentation, I'm going to read the biographies of all three so that we can get that out of the way and right into our discussion. So the three researchers that are joining us today are Anne Pasek. Anne is an interdisciplinary researcher working at the intersections of climate communication, the environmental humanities, and science and technology studies. She studies how carbon becomes communicable in different communities and media forms to different political and material effects. Anne is an assistant professor in the Department of Cultural Studies and the School of the Environment at Trent University, where she is also the Canada Research Chair in Media, Culture, and the Environment. Our second presenter today is Caleb Wellum, who is a research associate at the University of Waterloo. He writes and teaches about modern history, politics, and culture. Dr. Wellum, Caleb also serves as the research manager of the Petrocultures Research Group, and as a member of that group, he contributed to the collectively authored book, After Oil, and also a recent project on the possibility of a solar future. Caleb is now working on a book about the 1970s energy crisis in the United States, and he's published on the history of energy conservation, on oil futures, car films, and the future of the humanities, among other topics. Final guest today is Lisa Parks, who is Distinguished Professor of Film and Media Studies at UC Santa Barbara. She's a media scholar whose research focuses on multiple areas: satellite technologies and media globalization, critical studies of media infrastructures, media, militarization and surveillance, and environmental media. Lisa is the author of Rethinking Media Coverage, Vertical Mediation and the War on Terror, which was published in 2018, and Cultures in Orbit, Satellites and the Televisual, published in 2005. She's the director of UCSB's Global Media Technologies and Cultures Lab, which she initiated at MIT. She's also a 2018 MacArthur Fellow and has held other fellowships and visiting appointments at many, many places, including the International Research Center for Cultural Techniques and Media Philosophy and at the Bauhaus University in Weimar. I think what I'll do is ask our guests to talk in the order that I've read their bios in. So I'll ask Anne to go first, Caleb to go after, and then Lisa to follow. Jennifer, will you be keeping time, or should I be rude and jump in when the time is up?
Yes.
I'd rather you be rude.
I can certainly keep time. I will send each of the speakers a message and let you know when you have 2 minutes left, and then when you're out of time.
Okay, thank you very much. And please, Anne, lead us off.
All right. So welcome everyone, and my profound thanks to all the organizers who've put this really exciting conversation together. I am going to speak to you through the medium of PowerPoint, as we are so often to do. I'm just really excited for this conversation. And I'm really especially pleased to join it because I feel like in my work, I've been circling around the intersections between the energy humanities and the digital humanities in several very different ways. And I'm really glad to have this occasion and this company to think a little bit further about what happens when they meet. My opening remarks are going to be a scattershot, right? I'm giving you less a coherent thesis and more just opening a bunch of doors that I would love to walk through with you all. So to start things off, as Imre mentioned, my main academic research looks at climate communications, specifically how people think about carbon and try and make it socially meaningful. So carbon is an element and it moves across the climate system through many different kinds of materials, all with really different economic and sensory relations. So this work tries to think about what's at stake when the materiality of what we're trying to rally around politically is often invisible and often in flux, right? Carbon is really hard, is sort of a basic thesis there. And this led to a minor fascination with what happens when a company declares that it's carbon neutral. So I have an early book chapter digging into one of the most vocal proponents of this claim, which was Microsoft. And as you might imagine, I discovered that when Microsoft thought about carbon, they were principally thinking about energy because they made the switch to being a carbon neutral company at the same time that they made a switch from being primarily a software company to being primarily a cloud service provider company. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about how that's not just a coincidence, but how there's a kind of energy logics that undergirds both the production of environmental harm and then the management of those externalities. And as you've probably heard, data centers require an absolutely huge amount of energy to run. So the whole cloud service sector's financial, logistical, and regulatory challenges are all tied up in energy prices and their carbon emissions. So this quote, which is taken from Microsoft's general manager of energy, like it's so cool that they have one of those. I think it gets at how companies at this scale in general think about how infrastructure gets built. And one of the consequences of this approach, in the case of this data center in particular in Virginia, was that many coal-powered plants in the American South ended up enjoying a much longer lifespan, or were built brand new when they really shouldn't have been, because of the huge energy demand from cloud computing and the need for a steady state demand too, right? No intermittency, tons of overbuilt backup systems. So there was this, sort of retroactive push to put a lot of effort into neutralizing this impact after these systems had all been built. And what we do with this fact as scholars is, to me, really interesting because it's, we often think about infrastructure as politics by other means, and a politics that operates on a particular time scale that we're kind of unused to thinking about, like decades out. So the kinds of raw materials that we're gathering to build the cloud seems like a really obvious juncture in which we could think about data and climate in ways that are situated in place and sort of move from the ground up. But since then, I've joined a research project that is attempting to conduct a carbon footprint analysis on the undersea cable system. So I'm working with Lisa's old advisee and my old advisor, Nicole Staroselsky, to assess with some degree of clarity. It's fun figuring out how. To assess how this component of the ITC industry compares to the story that we hear about data centers, right? Or other sort of scary media projections about how the sector is going to grow to take up like a third of all energy use on the planet by 2030. We hear that this could be potentially quite bad, but we don't know with clarity what part and to what degree. And while we're still very much in the early stage of our research, we're finding that there's, broad worries, but also a fair amount of overestimating, but overall just an incredible amount of ideology. Caught up in all these numbers are much larger debates about the potential decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions, and thus really the viability of capitalism on a warming world much more broadly. These are all things that make me very excited to be having this conversation with a historian of the 1970s oil crisis, right? There's a kind of echo of history here. There's certainly a lot riding on the tech sector's ability to reduce its emissions while also still growing exponentially. And in doing so, make clean growth possible for a lot of other sectors. So across these projects, what I'm tracking is a story about an industry, right? Perhaps the most powerful industry in the economy we're moving towards today. An industry which is trying to resolve the contradictions of capitalism as a whole. And much more modestly, amid all my time analyzing carbon footprints, I thought I should do one of my own, looking at the carbon intensity of different dissertation research methods. So I footprinted my dissertation, and the big conclusion here is that flying is the #1 worst thing that I did over the course of my studies. And is still much worse than moving towards an online conference, right? Even though there's a lot of concern today about streaming media. But still, I'm interested in thinking about what computing and online research exchanges might look like, especially if they're built with different energy logics behind them. And this has involved some critical making projects in concert with people behind the project called Solar Protocol. So there's some really exciting collaborators who are building a solar powered network that would direct traffic to whatever part of the world has the most sun, instead of whatever server is the closest to you, as is the case with almost all systems on the networks today. So for my part, this involved building a solar powered web server in my backyard, which I hope to use as DIY infrastructure to share some of my research and act as a kind of experimental constraint on the kinds of research that I can share. Right? Given that it will all have to fit on this really tiny Raspberry Pi, and that if it rains and is cloudy too much, that website might go down. So my collaborators and I are thinking about how to work with much smaller files, how to go back to good old HTML, and also how intermittency might act as a constraint, but also a really potentially interesting way of like connecting digital networks back to ecological systems. And how it may be quite advantageous to have more and more of our work lives tied to things that are solar dependent. And wouldn't it be great if we couldn't access our emails at 10 p.m.? And if these questions interest you, we should chat more. I'm trying to get a research group up and running that explores the carbon intensity of research norms and methods across a range of disciplines. And I'd love to know what this problem looks like from the perspective of someone with maybe far more computationally or data intensive requirements. We're winding down a lecture series this April, and we hope to run some workshops in the summer that build towards some co-authored publications and more weird research creation and critical making projects. So please get in touch if you're curious. And I will leave it there. Thank you all so much, and I am looking forward to our chat.
Thank you very much, Anne. We will now turn to Caleb. Caleb, please share your screen as well.
Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint presentation? Yes, good. Okay, so good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to also express my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this conversation this afternoon. As a Canadian, I would typically comment on the weather and thank you all for joining me on such a nice day or something, but I realize that no longer makes sense because we're scattered about. So thanks for joining us on a beautiful day in Toronto. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of my research. I'm just going to talk about 4 projects that have some intersection, I think, with the work of my colleagues today as a starting off point for our discussion. So I'm a cultural historian of energy and the economy in the post-war United States. I'm interested in narratives that people in the past and the present have constructed around energy and around the technologies and economies that are heavily energy dependent. I'm particularly interested in moments of crisis in energy supplies, especially the 1970s, and how these crises have shaped political culture and the economy. I'm also interested in stories that people tell about the economy and how energy figures into those stories or how it doesn't figure into those stories. So some of the through lines in my work include the history of neoliberalism as well, and in relationship to energy, the uses of crisis, techno-utopianism, and visual culture. So my first, just gonna switch the slide. First major project, which is hopefully relatively shortly coming out as a book, is called Energizing Neoliberalism. This is a history of the relationship between the 1970s energy crisis and the emergence of neoliberalism. This was a period of significant doubt about the energy basis for US capitalism and created a significant opportunity for energy transition, for cultural change that wasn't realized, sort of fizzled out by the early 1980s. So the book tracks how speculative energy futures, particularly crisis futures, catalyzed the energy crisis and inspired calls to discipline what people started to talk about as America's profligate energy consumption through an energy conservation ethic. And that effort to discipline popular energy consumption then evolves, as the book traces, into the financialization of oil futures that discipline consumption in a different way. But in parallel to financialization, you have the rise of what I call petropopulism, as manifest in this poster for Sam Peckinpah's 1978 film Convoy, which rejected conservation as legitimate, or the restriction of Americans' mobility as a legitimate state interest or action. Major takeaways from the book include reframing neoliberalism as a structure of feeling rooted in abundant fossil fuels, the political flexibility of crisis claims, and the role of ecological thinking and environmentalism, popular environmentalism, in the shift towards neoliberal austerity. My next project, what I'm just getting started on, grows out of this Energizing Neoliberalism book. And this brings me more into the DH realm a little bit. I think a lot of people say I'm new to DH, but for me, it's really true. I'm relatively new to DH. So the next project is going to be a critical history of what used to be called the new economy or the information economy based on computers. And sort of it's the economy that we now live in. So working on Energizing Neoliberalism, I noticed there was a link between the claim that the energy crisis was over and that a new era was about to begin, and this was the era of the so-called new economy. So there are people like Paul Hawken claiming that a digital economy, this is in the early 1980s, would allow economic growth to continue in an energy efficient manner. So for many, if the energy crisis embodied the limits to growth, crisis of capitalism, the new economy was the salvation of capitalism and the path toward its future in the 1980s. And this Time magazine cover beautifully captures that sense. You have the robot with the picture of growth on the chest of the stock market going up, taking out the old industrial economy to the curb. And there's a lot of anxiety around this new economy, but there's a lot of hope that gets invested in it, which obviously many of us are familiar with today. So my plan is to write a history of the new economy that thinks critically about this post-industrial vision of a new economy, goes back into the post-war period to think about some of the energy links that gave rise to the notion of an energy efficient post-industrial economy, particularly the presumption of abundant nuclear power. And then it moves to the 1980s and 1990s to think about how it was the new economy came to be imagined as clean, efficient, and sustainable, And a key part of that is going to be to think about the outsourcing of carbon-intensive manufacturing to the global south. So at the same time that the new economy is developing, manufacturing in the United States is being offshored to other countries where pollution, carbon emissions are no longer part of the calculus of America's pollution, even though that's still part of the economy and part of what makes the new economy run. So this is it's a historical environmental humanities or energy humanities critique of the digital economy that frames the new economy as a political imaginary that's dependent on carbon energy, but which has from the beginning obfuscated that connection. Two more quick projects that I'm working on that sort of have grown out of this research. One is an online hub for energy humanities, commentary and thinking for a broad audience. So the web address here is energyhumanities.ca. This was co-founded with Imre Szeman and Mark Simpson back in October 2020. And the idea here is to help emerging scholars, but also more established scholars, write and think about contemporary issues, applying their research to what's going on right now, but writing for a broad audience. A lot of work has gone into this site. There's a lot of work left to be done. I can perhaps talk more in the discussion about the details of what's going on with the site, but it's been an interesting foray into digital publishing and some of the challenges that raises for discourse about these kinds of issues. A second recent project that has also just begun that I'm working on with Imre is what we're calling a Socio energy transition calculator. And I was excited to hear about Anne's work about carbon footprinting because there is a lot of overlap here. We're just starting to think about this idea of doing two things. First, writing an article that assesses the environmental communication capacities of carbon footprint tracking apps and how they frame the problem of climate change, but also then to design our own socio energy transition calculator that will do a number of things. We're hoping somehow to have the app demonstrate the limits of other kinds of apps for environmental communication, but also to draw attention to structural barriers to sustainability on the individual level. So where apps typically focus on individual consumption habits, we're hoping to use the app as an ideological tool to help people understand the barriers to the possibility of sustainable living for themselves. And third, it would provide information for policymakers and researchers about the kinds of futures that users express support for or reservations about. So examples are something like the IKEA's Better Living calculator here, which promises dozens of climate action possibilities in your pocket. We're going to think critically about how these things work, the kind of ideological work they do, and then try to create something that does something a little bit different, hopefully more useful. So I will leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Caleb. I now invite our last presenter, to Lisa, to tell us about her projects.
Can you guys see that okay? Okay, yes, all right. Thank you to Jennifer and Imre and Caleb and Anne all for being here, and to everybody else. And just want to say thanks to Imre for his intellectual leadership in this area over quite a period of time. I'm grateful to him for carving paths forward for us all to think within. As a humanities-based media scholar, I'm interested in how people energize media technologies, whether mobile phones, TV sets, computers, or stereo systems in different parts of the world, and how such energizing practices in turn shape the content and form of media and environmental conditions. And I've worked on related topics in rural Zambia and Tanzania off and on for the past 6 or 7 years. After engaging with a variety of contexts, it's become clear to me that those who live in post-industrial conditions of energy surplus have much to learn from those who negotiate energy scarcity. And in my brief comments today, I'd like to discuss some research in progress on domestic solar setups in semi-rural areas in Tanzania in order to encourage further thinking about the material preconditions required for people's participation in the global media economy. Some of the broader research questions that I'm interested in include what kinds of energy-related activities do media consumers engage in to participate in the media economy? How do those who live off the grid power up and recharge their devices, and what kinds of labor is involved? Who has the power to know about how energy and media technologies work, and how is this issue correlated with socioeconomic hierarchies of gender, class, age, nation, and ability, and so on? And finally, how do these issues relate to concerns about energy justice and climate disruption? Since most people in Tanzania and other parts of Africa live beyond national electrical grids, the solar panel has become a vital technology, supporting everything from domestic illumination to computing. During the past decade, mobile phone, internet, and social media use have dramatically increased in Tanzania. Of a population of more than 57 million people, 81% use mobile phones, 43% use internet, and 17% of homes have television. However, as mentioned, most Tanzanian users of these technologies lack electrical grid access at home. In Tanzania in 2016, about 33% of households had electricity. And of those, 25% were electrified through solar power. In areas where we did our preliminary field work, about 65 to 75% of households were totally unconnected to the electrical grid. As it's probably clear, most Tanzanians cannot afford home electrical service, and they adopt an opportunistic relationship to grid power, poaching it when possible to recharge devices, whether at work, community centers, or from neighbors. And the area where we were working is in this region, outside of Dar es Salaam, in 3 different communities. And I've also worked up in the Mara region as well. What I want to emphasize here is that these conditions of non-electrical grid access at home are not the exception, but the norm for most people in the world, especially those in low-income developing regions. So given discrepancies in these numbers of mobile phone users in the country, which was 81% of the population, and those with electrical access, 32% in Tanzania, my lab partnered with a team of faculty and students at the Dar es Salaam Institute of Technology and decided to investigate how Tanzanians in semi-rural areas beyond the urban center energize their media devices. And we worked with these team members as well as this team of grad students from, I was at MIT at this time when we did this work. And in 2019, we conducted interviews with solar users and merchants in 3 communities, Chanika, Mbezi Seniga, and Kiswara, exploring who in the home understood how the solar panel worked, who had installed it, how much it cost, whether it was functioning well, what its relationship was to various devices in the home. We also photographed domestic solar setups outside the home and inside the home. And I don't have time to go into all of our research here, but I'll just close by summarizing 3 issues that kind of emerged in our research. the relation between renewable and non-renewable energy sources, conceptualization of media as a process of energy transfer, and then the positing of an energy media matrix. Often solar power is positioned as a preferable or more just energy source because of its renewability, but it's important not to overlook the particularities of its material contexts. In Tanzania, domestic solar setups interconnect with and rely on lead-acid batteries and media devices that contain lithium batteries, which are part of extractive economies. So I think it's important to think about solar in relation to these other kinds of mined materials that end up becoming part of domestic contexts. There's also the matter of transporting solar equipment to Africa, whether from China or elsewhere, on huge shipping vessels that enter the port of Dar es Salaam. And we've not included energy inventories of manufacturing or shipping of solar into our analysis so far, but some of the families we interviewed complained about cheap and poorly made cables used to connect solar panels to other devices, indicating that they often failed and had to be frequently replaced, which would necessitate further shipping of these kinds of supplies. So while solar may be preferable to fossil fuels or lithium batteries, its relationalities to other materials should not be ignored or under-addressed. And so the second point I want to close with is through these contexts that we looked at, it was possible to conceptualize media as a process of energy transfer. And this occurs at one level in the sense that we have radiation from the sun that is converted by photovoltaic cells into electronic energy that powers up devices that's used to illuminate spaces and receive, record, download, upload, and network audiovisual content. But these kinds of processes are only possible because of people's energizing practices. In Tanzania and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, climbing up stools and ladders, installing panels, rerouting cables, and adjusting connectors are as integral to the global media economy as screens and speakers. Families who operate domestic solar setups function as like micro-level substations for the global media economy. They capture, combine, and daisy chain human and non-human energy so that it can be transferred to media devices. These socio-technical relations are part of an informal media economy. While the solar panel is visible on the roof, other aspects of this labor occurs inside of homes and is relatively invisible and unknown in media studies. Suffice it to say, the contingency of media upon particular arrangements of energy resources needs further investigation. And then finally, I want to close with this slide, just kind of positing the idea of an energy media matrix. That is, we could, it might behoove us to start naming the energy sources of media when we can, so that we become more aware of the material specificities of media and their planetary impacts. So, and this might even be moving us toward an energy media rating system. So we could consider various factors. Is the energizing of that media content mono-sourced or poly-sourced? So what range of sources of energy are used to create and consume media? What type of source is used? Is it carbon-related sources or solar? And the whole spectrum in between. Is it a trace or a surge of sources that's used in this particular media content or formation? What is the economic impact of it? Is it a big Hollywood blockbuster or a GIF file that hardly gets used? And then we could have an environmental assessment. Is it unsustainable or sustainable? And again, these are posited as broad spectra of possibilities and potentials. And so what I'm getting at here is, like, when we talk about light, we would not just talk about these as home lights, domestic lights, but as solar lights, because they're powered up by a solar panel. if we wanted to talk about this type of television, we wouldn't just call it TV, we'd call it solar lead acid TV, because the solar panel is connected to a lead acid battery that then generates the power to allow this TV to function. Or in a mobile phone video, we might call it this is a screen capture from a mobile phone video that we shot. We would call this solar lithium video rather than just a cell phone video. So I'll close there, but just that's something that we're trying to work toward, a kind of new lexicon for thinking about how we name and refer to media content and products in language. And thank you.
So I invite questions. I will start off the questions. I must admit I could talk for hours now with each of the presenters, so I'm going to really try to limit myself to one question just to get things going. One of the things I would say was a theme I found in all three of the presentations was that there was an insistence not just that there be research on energy, but there be some attention to the energy of research. I'd just be curious to hear each of you comment a little bit more about this. And perhaps following up on Lisa's last points, the energy of research should not just be, not to kind of twist things into impossible to understand ties, but my sense is that the energy of research is not something that should only be limited to the kind of research that focuses on energy specifically, but should be something that is carried across analysis of media or other cultural forms. So I'm just curious to hear each of you comment on that. How is research on energy, how is the energy of research also important to that?
Well, just to jump in and continue what Lisa's saying, I think we can develop nomenclatures for different modes of doing research. So we can talk about like jet-powered research or high carbon research, which involves, a lot of plane travel and makes possible, not to imply this is the case deterministically, but makes possible like kind of extractive relationships often with research partners, or is often only open to people who occupy really elite positions in elite universities. So a kind of hypothesis that I'm working with is that a move towards lower carbon norms would result in some equity gains across the academy and maybe a more structurally favored kind of collaboration with people in the global south. So there are going to be contexts where like travel makes a lot of sense and can be done intelligently and bear a lot of rewards. There are also cases where it won't, and maybe not being able to get on a plane to go to an archive for a week or to zoom in and out of a community, as I myself have done, that might mean finding co-authorship opportunities for people who are already in these communities, already doing this work, and don't get the credit because they don't belong to a global North university. So that's a provocation. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that just energy humanities research in general, by drawing attention to the energy dynamics of social processes and knowledge production, demands that university researchers start thinking about their own energy practices. And I have no answers, but I think this is going to be very challenging for historians, in part because historical research is so much about going to physical archives, and there's still a romanticism around being in the archive and digging through the archive, and it requires an incredible amount of travel as part of just what you do as a historian. So I'm not sure what a low carbon history will look like. I like Anne's idea of co-authorship opportunities, more collective research projects, trying to get beyond the methodological individualism of history as it's practiced today. But it's going to take some serious thinking about how to become more sustainable in our research practices and assumptions about what makes good historical research, about how historians and archival researchers work together. And I know that archives are working on digitizing material. which is great, and also perhaps creates its own set of issues. But nevertheless, I think that's still a serious challenge.
I think this is a great question for discussion, and I hope the conversation will continue beyond. Before I came today, I looked, I didn't read it as carefully as I'm going to, but I looked at Anne's article, which I recommend. It's called Low Carbon Research, Building a Greener and More Inclusive Academy, that just came out in 2020 in the journal Engaging Science, Technology, and Society. And after reading it, I was like, oh, I don't even know if I want to present this project today, because, you know, one of the slides I didn't include about energy was our flights and impact while being in Tanzania. So I'm still formulating like a kind of response to the question of like what's at stake in continuing to do international field work at this moment. But the thing that I'll just say off the top of my head is just the idea that being in a field of media studies that has historically been so dominated by concerns about Hollywood and a kind of belly button approach to media studies, at one point in my career, I became really convinced that I would learn more about my field if I spent time outside of the United States or North America and really try to unlearn some of the norms and dominant formations of media studies by thinking in relation to and alongside other people and communities that were quite different from my own. And so I have tried to commit to that over the past decade or more, and yet I'm faced with the prospect that that is not a good research practice because of the energy concerns. So I think we all have to think about these issues and try to figure out paths forward that make sense to us. And I also think it's important to not be completely dogmatic and to think carefully and in nuanced ways about what the trade-offs are in such situations, because I certainly don't want to continue being a media scholar in a kind of North American bubble that doesn't have a embodied and kind of phenomenologically informed way, a sense of how people are living in quite different and disparate ways on this planet. So that's kind of how I'll respond to that. And I think, like I said, there's a lot more to discuss, and I appreciate the questions.
Invite questions. Oh, here we go. I can't tell if this is a question or not.
It is not a question.
Okay, thanks, Brent.
Just stimulated by thank you, everyone.
I'll throw another question out there, if that's okay. So another kind of theme I hear in the research to varying levels is that each of you are trying to make sense of the varied ideologies that are that play through the field of energy. And this is a contested field where there are discourses that are being generated as kind of, they're both counter-hegemonic discourses, but there are certainly pushback from hegemonic discourses through things like the appeal to net zero projects like the one or that companies are engaged in or countries are engaged in, the whole protocol of ESG that companies are starting to include in their practices, even the, however crazy it might seem, the type of activities that are being taken up by the Canadian Energy Centre in Alberta. There's this competing terrain of ideologies. And I wonder how each of you tries to do your work in relationship to this difficult contested terrain that is not only intending to muddy public discourse, but I think is trying to have some impact on academic discourse as well, kind of agenda setting, or perhaps providing kinds of discourses with which we have to contend and compete, as opposed to carrying out the kinds of research that we might want to. And I'm sorry if that's a convoluted question, but curious to hear what you say.
I don't have a cogent answer ready at hand. I'll just say that I feel like that's a question you want to contextualize with the past year, and as we know, with so much scholarship on crises, right? There's a way in which a person, a political movement, a political project can kind of get in front of a crisis and sort of use it to do political work. And so it's been quite interesting to see how barriers and boundaries around what's possible or proper have changed pretty rapidly. And I'm currently waging a multi-person war in my academic society to get them to be open to remote participation in the future. And we've got much more credence behind us a year into a pandemic where we've all been meeting through Zoom. And that seems like broadly helpful and encouraging, though we can also expect there will be a backlash when things return to normal, whatever normal will look like. And just also on like a personal note, I think this has also been a year where being a solitary academic sitting in our little offices, real or improvised, all by ourselves writing into the void has been especially hard, and that collaboration has been a kind of bright light for me in the strains of pandemic living. So again, something that I would love to sort of see cultivated and continued thereafter. I'll leave it there.
I think I've become more interested in the communication or what is sometimes called the knowledge mobilization side of academic research. In response to that question of the competing ideologies, sort of muddying the water around questions of climate and energy. And that's very much what the energyhumanities.ca website is about trying to translate academic research in clear language to contemporary issues in a way that oftentimes directly confronts those ideologies muddying the water. So we've published articles on the Alberta government's attempt to discredit alternative energy activism and criticism of tar sands. We've published articles about the implications of the Biden administration, about discourses in the COVID-19 pandemic around the future of cities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been interesting to participate in because I think I already knew this, but it's very hard to get traction when you are just a few academics working on a website project, because things like design and spreading the word about your project is just, those are skill intensive, time intensive activities that do detract from what you might think of as your more basic research activities. So it's been challenging to get people to pay attention. One example I would give is that we secured an interview with Anne Paul, who is the leader of Canada's Federal Green Party, and we thought this would surely, like, this is going to get some attention, this interview. And how many views do the YouTube videos have? Like 30, 15, depending on the topic. So it's just hard. There's so much noise out there online. And there's so much money behind competing narratives that it can be, it's a serious challenge. And I think universities are starting to think about how they can support their researchers in this way, but there's still a long way to go.
I'm not sure I completely understand what the question is. So, but I want to say that I have found myself like moving more away from thinking just about ideology and in the context of this academic work, and really going back more to political economy methods and building on some of the solar media work in Tanzania. I've been doing some research on the new regional data center hubs in sub-Saharan Africa, in Lagos and Nairobi and in Cape Town and Johannesburg, and trying to just track corporate investments. And some of these initiatives started out as African-owned operations, and they've been just bought up recently because of a so-called cloud boom in Africa, which ideologically echoes a lot of the kind of, you know, population explosion discourse from the 1960s. And but I've just been trying to track ownership of these data centers and looking at how huge private equity firms that are based in the UK and the United States are buying up majority shares in some of these operations. And it's ironic because the energy infrastructure in some of these areas is pretty problematic and fraught and not optimal to support these operations. And Anne has written about this in the context of Microsoft data centers. But in addition to thinking about ideology, I think like tracking investments right now and thinking about the operations of these private equity companies and what they're doing is also really important.
We're nearing the end of our time. There is an excellent question here by Elia Vargas, and if I was to read it out, I think we'd use up the rest of the time. So please take a look. I invite the presenters to take a look at it. But maybe how I'll end is just to ask each of you to speak for about 30 seconds, and maybe you can reflect on what your partners today, some of the things that they said, what stood out to you, what might impact your own work. Yeah, really generous of me to say 30 seconds, I know.
I'll just say that it's always a delight to share a stage with a historian and someone who's working more ethnographically, because we really do, I think, need a diversity of methods to attend to these questions. And as our excellent question from Elia mentions, right, the diversity of the methods is probably also going to be expressed through the diversity of the energy that motivates our research and materially supports it.
I'm always inspired by Anne's work to think seriously about research methods and how we can change them. She takes it very seriously, and I always find it challenging to me to think about how to respond to research. And with what Lisa said, I was struck by what she said about how people in the post-industrial, energy-abundant countries have a lot to learn from people who live under conditions of energy scarcity. That, to me, is an interesting, exciting idea when thinking about possible energy futures as well. The learning that we do have a lot to learn going that direction, instead of always talking about how, you know, post-industrial countries need to be models for so-called developing nations. I find intriguing the notion of thinking, for myself, just thinking more seriously about energy conditions that are wholly different from the things that I research and live every day.
I guess I'll just say that, you know, I think the question of methodological experimentation and creativity is really important and has been to me for quite some time. In the work that I presented today, the collaboration with partners from DIT emerged after we participated in a workshop together for 2 or 3 weeks and formed relationships by working together very closely all day, every day. And a lot of it was very student driven. And I wish I had more time to kind of go into detail about all of the ways in which methodologically we tried to work on this project. We were asked to talk for 5 to 7 minutes, so I couldn't go into detail about it. But I do think that the point about the potential for extractive disposition toward research partners in other countries is something that I'm always thinking about. At the same time, I don't want to close off the possibility of, you know, equitable or, you know, an aspiration toward equitable relationalities and co-creation and collaboration together. And that's something that I try to focus on a lot when I'm doing international field-based research. yeah, I mean, I've been working that way for quite some time and try as much as I can to continue the relationships that I establish with people when I work abroad and co-author. I've mostly been co-authoring in the last few years. So anyway, not sure that answers your question, Imre, but I just appreciate the conversation and hope we can find ways to keep discussing all these issues.
I think it does answer the question. What came through for me, if I could summarize, especially in the last few points, is the necessity of this particular topic to, and of course, every topic should push us towards this, but the topic of energy opens up in a very, very forceful way this question of different kinds of methodologies, attention to the infrastructural demands, also the resource demands of different ways of doing and of doing research, which I suppose, just to follow what Anne said, is it does make insistence, it produces an insistence that we collaborate with one another. You said this as well, Lisa, but collaborate perhaps in a different kind of way. Well, I did not want to have the last word, but I did want to end by thanking the three presenters. I am amazed what the three of you did in 5 to 7 minutes. You communicate a lot of information. You left us with, I think I can certainly speak for myself, but perhaps for everybody else here, that it has left us wanting to know more about what each of you are doing. So that's what the web is for. Look up each of these people's names in Google and you'll find out a lot about what they're doing.
And I'll just jump in and say that all of the links that were shared in chat today, I will send those out with the recording of this lunch, and they'll also be available up on our website, which I'm dropping into chat right now. So thank you everyone for presenting, for attending. It's been a wonderful conversation. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.